Good morning. Welcome to this session of the 2020 Postal History Symposium, sponsored by the American Philatelic Society, the American Philatelic Research Library, the Smithsonian's National Postal Museum, and this year by the United States Philatelic Classic Society. I am Scott Tiffany, Librarian and Director of Information Services at the American Philatelic Research Library. Our presenter for this session will be William DeWitt, and the title for his presentation is Evolution of Intercity Mail Transportation Modes, 1840 to 1880, Insights from Postmaster General Annual Reports. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Bill DeWitt. Bill will be going into more detail during his talk about his professional and philatelic accomplishments, but he has asked me to mention that he is a proud member of the American Topical Association, the American Philatelic Society, the American Philatelic Research Library, the United States Philatelic Classic Society, the American Stamp Dealers Association, the United States Stamp Society, the Mobile Post Office Society, the United Postal Stationery Society, and the Collectors Club of New York. He is also an active member in the Brandywine Valley Stamp Society and The Gathering in Westchester, PA. So without further ado, the 2020 Postal History Symposium proudly presents Mr. Bill DeWitt. Bill?
Well, thank you very much, Scott. It's a delight to be here. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the evolution of the modes from 1840 to 1880, and I was pretty startled to end up at this point. I've been in transportation for 50 years. For most of my career, over half of my career, I worked for various railroads, Navy, et cetera, and then went back, got a PhD after I left Burlington Northern, or it left me, and went to teach and be dean at various universities. So I've had about half of my career in the railroad business and related modes, and about half as a professor and dean, and I've absolutely loved it. Transportation has been my life. The stamp collecting became a big thing for me about 30 years ago when I started collecting transportation stamps. And people will say, well, what are transportation stamps? Well, it's any vehicle that carries people or stuff. I don't do sports events, people that are walking, etc. And I had a collection well underway when I left to pursue other interests from Burlington and went to Tennessee to get my doctorate. And the department chair there, Dave Schumann, was a big stamp guy and said, hey, I can help you get your stamps organized and make some sense out of them. And so I took him up on that. And that was a delightful opportunity. But I found that my interest in stamps was influenced by my grandfathers on both sides of the family. When I started collecting, and you can see the blue lines here, I was collecting U.S. transportation stamps, and I have about 1,200 or so in my database. That includes all modes, say that carry people or stuff. And what I found startled me was that the stamps that were issued during this time period of 1840 to 1880 were only a handful. Most of them were around 1869. I threw in the Wells Fargo stamps and some of the envelopes that were there. And what I was going through the Postmaster General report and found in 1870 that Cresswell, the Postmaster General, said, hey, those 1869 stamps are pretty bad. They're small. No one likes transportation images. They don't have enough adhesive on it. And so I'm going to put a whole new issue out. And as a transportation guy, I was kind of heartbroken on that, but that was the reality. There was in that time period a couple of embossed envelopes put out, and of course repeated again in 1976. And I really like the image on the envelope that goes from the post rider all the way up to airplanes and ships. But going back to the emotional side of it, my grandfather on the maternal side used to take me to the post office. This is the old Auburn post office. It's still there, but they have a new building. And we used to go up the steps by that brown door in the lower right-hand corner, and he would say, "Come on, I'm going to go get some new stamps." And I never collected back then, but his enthusiasm, his interest in getting plate blocks, numbered plate blocks, was catching. And so there are some of these stamps are very emotional for me. The Kansas statehood stamp, the Fort Sumner stamp, are ones that I vividly remember him getting and being delighted that he had them, etc. And it went further that when Auburn celebrated the Alaska statehood, because Seward had his home there in Auburn, I got a first day issue cover from him. And when I was going through my parents' correspondence during the early part of World War II, I was delighted to see that my mother's mail to my father, this is just before he left to go into the service, was on the Syracuse and Rochester RPO. So there are things that emotionally kind of tie me into this whole field. And then I found that my grandfather, DeWitt, had taken photos, and he had published a monograph on poetry and photos. But he had a couple of postcards that showed the Lehigh Valley Railroad coming southbound on the west side of Owasco Lake. And I didn't know these existed. Lost him in '49 when I was very small. But I have found that this is the Pennsylvania, New York number 222. And all of a sudden, my grandfather has a relationship with postcards and trains that I found pretty special. I've had the opportunity to this summer to be a presenter for the first day of issue for the innovation stamp. That was fun because I got to talk about transportation. And of course, I'd be remiss to not mention that the American Topical Association has a series of checklists, an extensive series of checklists that you can access that shows all the stamps that not just the United States, but worldwide, that show all the stamps in various categories, and that's something that I have used going forward. And then, of course, I belong to the Casey Jones Railroad Unit, and that was the first American Topical Association study unit in 1950, and they are still involved with trains on stamps. So the emotional side of this, the connection with my career has been always there. But I got sidetracked. That's a transportation term. The main track that I was on was collecting transportation stamps, but all of a sudden I found the Postmaster General annual reports, and I started to get very interested in what's going on in the 1800s with intercity and continental mail transportation. I've had some discussions with people about how do you define this. Continental, I say, is just the main United States. Intercity, there are city type issues that go on of delivery, free delivery, and all the modes that were used then. And I do understand that some of the transportation that went to California and Oregon went down through the Panama Canal. Panama, the state of Panama, the canal wasn't there then, but crossed the isthmus and took steamboats up the west side in the Pacific. So in my material, I've got steamboats as a category, but they are usually by coastal, or they are used for the transportation to California. So this sidetrack that I got on kind of fit with what I did for a dissertation, which was archival. I collected 18,000 data points with transportation courses and transportation textbooks. I had 1,300 of them once upon a time. But that kind of gave me an interest or a background in doing archival discussions. And I ended up wanting to know what was going on. There was horsepower in the early 1800s, we know that. And as we've seen from Jim Milgram and Bush, that steam became a big factor in the 80s, 40s, and 50s, and I'll look at that in more detail with you. And then, of course, the transcontinental punched across the country in the 60s and 70s. And all of this took us into the 20th century and the age of the internal combustion engine. I'm going to stay with 1840, 1880, and that steam grew tremendously until we got to World War I, and then the internal combustion engine kind of kicked in. So when I got looking at the post office Postmaster General reports, the question is, what stats are there? And by the way, I did capture a lot of narrative material from the Postmaster General reports, 1840, 1880, and I have provided a PDF of those. They're in a table of contents format, so pretty easily searchable or assessed, and APS has that and we'll put it up. But there were two types of data that, and I'll show you some examples here. One was the point-to-point mileage. That was the route miles. That was the actual distance over the ground, kind of the geography, if you will. But what I'm really going to put time on is the whole issue of the miles traveled. That is where was the mail carried? And of course, on a particular route, there may be trains, 6, 7, 8 dozen trains a day. And so the miles piled up much more so than the route miles did. And that's will be the focus of this report, is looking at the miles traveled. So what was driving all of this? The country was growing very, very quickly, and the mails got heavy. Milgram talked about this, particularly with newspapers, which were very inexpensive to mail. They were very heavy, and the stagecoaches got overwhelmed and tended to say, okay, we'll just drop the newspapers on the ground. We won't take them. We'll take the first class stuff. I'm oversimplifying, but the speed issue, Barry in 1832, the Postmaster General said, hey, we think the mail ought to move at the same speed that a passenger can. And of course, later on in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you saw the railway post office that went on a lot of high-speed passenger trains, at least into the early 1900s. And so what I'm going to use on this is all the data that was derived from the Postmaster General reports. And I have the data in a spreadsheet from 1820 to 1920, but I'm going to only talk about the time from 1840 to 1880. So where did I get the data from? Well, I got it out of the Postmaster General reports, and before COVID, I spent a lot of time at the National Postal Museum Library. I also went up to the Postal Service Library. If you haven't been there, up on the 7th floor, it's a spectacular view of Washington. And I found the original or the print versions of the Postmaster General, but then found that Hathi Trust was in digital format. And it's spectacular. It's a PDF format. I have the ability to convert PDF to Word, and so that has been a tremendous boon to it. The American Philatelic Research Library that Scott runs was a big help during the summer of 2019. At that time, I was focused on stamps. Now I've shifted to look at the Postmaster General reports, and I have not had a chance to look at the Postmaster General letter books that went from 1789 to 1836. That'll be some future research, but part of it is those are handwritten and much more difficult to get through. So if you haven't seen the Postmaster General books, this is 1864. It's a relatively small version. You get into the 1890s, you end up with books that are 400 or 500 pages long. And it always starts out with a report from the Postmaster General. In this case, it was William Dennison. And it's a report to the president. This is the 1864. And so what I did in these is I looked at the data that was incorporated into the Postmaster General. And so if you look at this by state and territory, and of course some of our country was territories back then, it does have the route miles that are present in those particular states. And you can look at, you all know this are star routes, the certainty, celerity, and security, the 3 asterisks or 3 stars that were put by them by the clerks became star routes. And so these are route miles, and here you can see it, the route miles by state, by steamboat, by railroad. I'm wondering sometimes if those who do postal history and have covers would find this of interest to see how much transportation capability was available in the various states. And then what I look at is the whole issue of miles traveled. Um, this, to me, is actually where covers move. This is where the individual modes have carried transportation artifacts, history, envelopes, etc. And you can look at that by star routes, and we'll talk a little bit about those going forward. But I can also look at it by steamboat and by railroad, and then here's the total miles that are out there, and they throw in the total cost. And so what you want to understand as we go through here is that the route miles are in thousands. In this case, in 1964, there was 139,000 route miles, but the miles traveled where postal history was actually carried was almost 31 million miles. So I'm not going to get and take you through the route mile side of it, but we are going to talk about the miles traveled. And so this is what the country looked like about 1790. When I first saw this, I thought, what in the world about Vermont? But it didn't become a state to 1791. And so this is kind of the original 13 colonies. You see Florida's missing on there. And the post office started 1790 and got a permanent status 1794. And what you see in the early days is everything was horse-drawn or horse-bound, horse riders, sulkies, buggies, and of course the steamboat hadn't come into being, steam hadn't come into being until the early 1800s. So early on, everything was horses, and the post office was struggling with how do you get weight carried, and they started pushing hard on coaches, stagecoaches, because of that. The navigable waters issue, you saw this with John Bush, talked about the navigable waters, primarily rivers and coastal. We didn't get the Erie Canal till 1823, and that never became a significant carrier of mail. But they designated waters as post roads, and by 1824, the middle of the 1800s, you only had very few routes that were steam-based. I did find in Feldman the bottom data, which shows about the number of contracts for carriage. And again, this is the contracts by route. And the steamboats or steamships eventually would make multiple trips on there. So the routes are one measure, the miles traveled is another one. 1828, here is a report. There's not much data that I found because I haven't gone back through the handwritten early letters. But in 1828, about 10 million miles traveled. And, a big chunk of it was still on horseback, but coaches were starting to come into their own. And the Postmaster General in the early 1800s was told to transmit a statement talking about the post offices and how many there are and how many post roads and generally about the transportation of the mail. And by the 1820s, people really needed the U.S. mail system going forward. And the population grew. Here you can see that by the World War I, the end of my interest or the end of my data, the U.S. population was in the 100 million range. And what was also telling is that there was a shift from the rural to urban. And this just goes again until World War I approximately. There seems to be a further shift if you looked at this going forward. But the post offices continued to grow. You see a gap in the 1860s. That's when the southern post offices broke away from the United States and weren't counted any longer. And the drop-off of post offices in the early 1900s was primarily because of the RFD, rural free delivery, that now you had people had been getting free delivery to homes. Now all of a sudden you are getting free delivery to the rural side. And the little tiny corner post offices, I know Bob Roof had talked about his grandfather running a grocery store that was also a post office. Those kinds of facilities started to disappear, and so the count of post offices went down as RFD started to take over. The route miles, of course, fell off also. They very much paralleled what we were seeing in the post offices. As you got RFD, they were still traveling the distance, but it wasn't measured as route miles, which is the intercity kind of a capability. And so that fall off of route miles was similar to what the post offices were. And here is by mode. And if you look at this on the right-hand side, you'll see that the gray was the railroads. The green is the mode not specified, or the star routes. A little bit of steamboat thrown in there. And this was all in thousands. This is route miles. And so here's the era that we were talking about, as you see the transition from horse to steam. And I need to point out to you that there was recorded in the route miles in the early 1840s a little bit of railroad route miles, but it was almost a footnote going forward. The miles traveled were much more robust. You saw more of the modal change that was going on there. We're going to talk about this in more detail. And you can see on the left side the kind of orange-brown, the post-rider stagecoaches that up until the time of the Civil War then transitioned into the star routes. And we'll talk about that going forward. Remember that the miles traveled is in millions. The route miles are in thousands. So we're going to look at the miles traveled. 1832, you started to get a much broader expanse of territory that the U.S. needed to cover. And you also started to get the steamboats showing up on the coastal routes and on the river routes as part of this. And so the miles traveled by mode in the 1830s was mostly horse-powered, and you can see at the top a little piece of blue steamboat. And then in the late 1830s, they actually put in a category that was steamboat and railroad, kind of steam-driven, if you will. But clearly into the late 1830s, horse-driven, horse-powered was the big issue. And we're talking about millions of miles, so we've got about 35 million miles moving. The animal-powered, as I showed, there isn't much in the early stamps that reflects the modes. And it wasn't until we got into the 1900s, the 20th century, that we started to see various horse-drawn representations that might have carried the mail. Does not include things like Conestoga wagons and ox carts, et cetera, that were beasts of burden and carried goods, but the mail was a big deal. One of the things that I found intriguing, and I think you may hear more of this with Bill Schultz with toll gates, was this whole issue of sulky. In the early categories, the post office talked about sulkies a lot. And when I was growing up in upstate New York and Syracuse, we used to go to the sulky races over in Syracuse. They were kind of very slender, high-speed two-wheel carts with trotters that went on it. But in the early 1800s, the post office has a reference in their types of transportation of sulkies. And this is what a sulky might look like with a postman. The railroads that Jim Milgram talked about really became a significant part of the country starting in the 1830s. And you ended up with the early routes about 1832, a couple hundred miles, not much. By 1847, you had 5,000. And then as we got into the 50s and 60s, and of course the transcontinental, it moved very, very significantly up. Jim also talked about these early routes that were primarily on the East Coast, Northeast, a little bit down in South Carolina. And by 1837, they had a couple of contracts, 4 contracts that Feldman references. So the railroads were coming into their own, but very short distances. The advantage they had is that they were all weather and they could carry weight. So by the end of 1839, what we had was this horse-drawn capability and a little bit of steamboats. There really wasn't enough to show railroads on this. It was in the database, but didn't show. And so very dominant railroad based in the 1830s. What we're going to look at is the 1840s to 1880s. And if you look at the route miles, you can see the green, which is the modes not specified and star routes. And on top of that, you can see the rail and steamboat miles, route miles. Remember, that's kind of the geography. But when we start looking at the miles traveled, all of a sudden you see, as we approach the 1880s, the railroad miles grew tremendously. The steamboat didn't so much because they were limited to existing rivers. And if you think about the country where there are large cities that interact, the steamboats aren't very heavy there. There was some steamboat traffic that went to the Panama Isthmus and went across there, and the steamboat took up mail to California and Oregon. Those are counted in here. I did not count anything that had an offshore international aspect to it. So all the data that I collected, I worked to contain it into the domestic, if you will, side of the equation. 1840, the U.S. continued to grow. All of a sudden, the Louisiana Purchase, which had happened in 1803, began to expand up into the Northwest. I know my grandmother moved to Indiana with my folks, and she was born in 1880, and she was worried about the Indians in the Northwest Territory. She wasn't talking about the Pacific Northwest. She was talking about the Northwest Territory around Chicago, and we had to assure her that there really probably wasn't much problem with Indian raids at this point in time. The Act of 1845 established the star route, and what it said is that you have to go to the lowest bidder. That did exclude the railroads and the steamboats, but the bidder had to assure that they could do things with celerity, certainty, and security. The postal clerks got tired of writing those three words out, so they just used asterisks, and that gave the star route, asterisks or stars by the contract, gave the star route its name. And I found it interesting, by the middle of the Civil War, the category by coach in the just statistics of the post office was deleted. And so that whole category shifted to another whole approach. So we no longer had coaches when we got into the Civil War period. The route miles in the 40s, we had very little modal kind of interest, but the route miles were growing. They had 165,000. And I had showed you earlier those little bits of railroad in the 1840s. Here they are. And I'm not quite sure why they got put in there, because they were very nominal. But the detailed modal route structure and the statistics and reports didn't start until we got out of the 1840s and into the 1850s. In the 1840s, miles traveled moved from the coach and the horse to modes not specified. And so you see a little bit in the early to mid 1840s, the kind of medium gray is reporting as steamboat and railroad. And then by the late 40s, they split it off into steamboat and railroad as separate categories as we approach the 1850s. This was the time period, of course, of the Mexican-American War, the late 1840s, the gold rush in California, late 40s, early 50s, and that certainly motivated things tremendously going forward. I got asked about the label changes, and these are what the post office used. I use this in my database. Modes not specified were the 1840s and 50s. And they replaced the horse and the four-horse coach, the stagecoach. And then they started in the 1850s for about 5 or 6 years, something called the modes of inferior grade. And I was as a transportation guy, that kind of bothered me that they would talk about things that way. But I'll show you later what happened. And then, of course, that transferred over in 1862 to pick up the 1845 Act and start to put in star bids that were there. So we saw in the data capture transition from modes not specified to inferior to star bids as we got into the late 1800s. And of course, John Bush talked about the steamboats. They were prevalent on the rivers. And there were very few canals, and most of them were very slow, like the Erie Canal. So steamboats became a big deal. And in 1847, the post office said, Feldman, quoting from the Postmaster General's annual report, said, steamboats are an inferior grade of service to railroads. Although they're less expensive, they're less expeditious. They are superior to that of coaches, but again, was quite startled by this use of the word inferior. They did that with the coach business, and now they've done it with the steamboat business in the 1840s. So when we get to the end of the 1840s, what we've got is steamboats and the railroads are beginning to show up. And this is a new kind of a capability. And at the bottom, you'll see the telegraph, not a transportation mode, but having been in the business for years, the telegraph gave us almost instantaneous capability across the country. In fact, there was a big discussion for a number of years in the Postmaster General report about whether the Postal Service should own the telegraph. They actually talked about hiring a guy named Samuel Morse to be the superintendent of that. It didn't go through because of opposition from the private telegraph companies, but it gave us the ability to communicate very quickly. And of course, the railroads were a necessity because they could go, as the route miles expanded, they could go everywhere, all weather. So you could transmit an offer, accept it, and you could get it moved. And it was a very important part of the whole system. So as we came into the end of the 1840s, you've got, again, the Post Rider and the star routes, the orange and the green. Steamboats are pretty dominant because the railroads aren't that big at this point in time. They're growing, but they're not that big. And if we look at the 1850s, one of the things that struck me when I did this is that you had Texas in. The Alamo, of course, was 1835 or 36. You had California in. But there was a big openness. I worked for Burlington Northern. That was a lot of our territory. There just wasn't much out there as far as people or settlements or things being produced. The East Coast was very heavy in people and industry, and the West Coast, California and Oregon, but there was a big void in the center part, and we'll see in the transcontinentals that that'll take care of that. And so in the 1850s, the route miles became still horse-oriented. Although they were moving away from this, you started to see this mode of inferior grade by the late 1850s. The yellow mode's not specified, and a little bit of steamboat and railroad route miles. They haven't yet grown. And if you start looking at the miles traveled, that's where mail was carried. Now you end up with not only the modes not specified in inferior grade, but you end up with some steamboat and a growing railroad capability. So this was the shift from horsepower to steam power. And it was interesting to me, both Milgram and Bush in their presentations talked about the significance of the move to steam power, and I absolutely agree with them. It was a major technological innovation that changed the dynamics for transportation. And we're really not going to get into the whole issue of the Industrial Revolution and what it did for the ability to manufacture things and process agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. But this was the beginning of the transition. So we're talking millions. Now we're up to about 80 million miles traveled. Remember that the route miles are in the thousands. And if we look at the chart, we now still have modes not specified and star routes and the Post Rider Stagecoach in there. We're still talking about Butterfield, running the southern route through Arizona into Southern California. But all of a sudden, the railroads have gained. Steamboats actually haven't changed very much. My data shows they increased in the amount of carriage they did, but the railroads became the bigger piece of this pie going forward. So about 1860, we ended up with the same kind of configuration that we've been looking at, except for the disloyal or insurrectionist states. And I know there's a presentation later this week, I think tomorrow, on the Confederate states. But from the U.S. Post Office perspective, if you look at the left chart, there are some border states that weren't sure which side of the equation they were going to come down on. On the right side, you see that the Union has them in their category. But we ended up with insurrectionist or disloyal states in the 1860s that made a big difference. And so if you look at the route miles, all of a sudden they dropped off if you look from 1860 to 1862, that there was a chunk of miles that were in the South or Southern Controlled Territory. And so that became less prevalent. If we look at the star routes, they grew because in the 1860s, all of a sudden, they were saying we need to pick up that 1845 Act and convey them with celerity, certainty, and security. And star routes were used, and the other categories of inferior grades started to disappear, or did disappear, as a category in the statistics. If we look at the miles traveled, here the railroads became more and more prevalent. They weren't quite dominant. The star routes were still the top. Remember, that's still horse-drawn coaches and horse riders. Steamboats, the categories are a little bit misleading because the steamboats continued the same amount of travel, grew actually a little bit year after year, but in the proportion to everything else, were not a significant factor as we got into the 1860s. And of course, once we got through the Civil War, you started to end up with people really pushing westward. And so the millions of miles now started pushing 100 million miles. And the railroads, as they got into the late Civil War and later 1800s, started to develop very powerful locomotives. We started to see the RPOs come in, and it changed things dramatically. Remember, they wanted speed, as fast as passengers, and they wanted to be able to carry weight along with the reliability. And the railroads were able to do all of that going forward. So we get to the end of the 1860s. Remember, this is before the transcontinental is put through. We now have the railroads, basically steam, if you will, both the railroads and steamboats, are half of the total business. And the Post Rider and Stagecoach have disappeared, but the star routes are there. And it's generally a change in the category label in the statistics in the Postmaster General reports, same kind of business that was going on. In 1870, the U.S. Finally put all the pieces together. Transcontinental Railroad was punched through 1869. And the railroads and the people started moving west, and that created a tremendous challenge for the post office. The Transcontinental Railroad, you probably know this data, was made up of two components: the Union Pacific Railroad, about 1,000 miles from the east, and the Central Pacific Railroad from the west. And so from Omaha, which was the eastern terminus of the Union Pacific, and that's where, of course, the stamp show was last year. That to San Francisco was 1,900 miles. Unheard of. The fact that you could move transportation and mail that quickly over that kind of distance was a brand new phenomenon. And Jim Milgram talked about this a little bit. The average transit time in 1872, this is about 3 years after the Transcontinental was put through, westbound was about 9 days, and eastbound was about 8.25 days. And so we had gone from months of the wagons and the ships going around Cape Horn down to weeks, and now you could consistently have mail delivered in 8 or 9 days across the country. I did find this, having lived in Maine at Maine Maritime Academy for a while, that they published in 1871, Creswell published this greatest distance that from Vanceboro, Maine, and I was kind of like, where is Vanceboro and why? But it was a border crossing that President Grant and Governor General of Canada had gone to in 1871 to celebrate the connection between Canada and the U.S. So Vanceboro was a starting point, and they said to San Francisco, we had 3,800 miles that we could do by rail all the way across. And New Orleans, which had been talked about again with John Bush, the whole issue of the steamboats in that area, let alone the fact that the Battle of 1815 had been won. But that was 2,000 miles. And just as a point of reference, the post office was saying, hey, we can go long distances and just about everywhere. So, the post office was responding to what the American people were doing, moving across the country. In the Grange poster, in the viaduct and behind the knees of the person standing there, there is a train going across. Banking certainly supported all of that, and there's a farm in the foreground and a factory in the background, but in the middle is a train going across the country. And of course, in the agricultural side, which the Midwest became known for, here and across the wheat field is a train moving. And finally, industry and manufacturing as we got into the Industrial Revolution. And here's the Pullman factory with trains on the outside of it. So the mail was supporting all of these things, the demand for the people for correspondence, the ability to do banking, the ability to move stuff was very important for this time frame. The route miles in 1870 were star routes. Remember, that's the geography. That's the fundamental distance, looking at about 300,000 miles here by the end of the 1870s. But when you start looking at the miles traveled, you're over 160 million miles. And the big chunk of that now is the railroad. The railroads had built heavily. They were all weather. They could carry the weight, and they started displacing some of the star routes that were out there. So when we get to the end of the 70s, here we've got steam now has taken the majority of the mail carriage. And the star routes have less of that. They're running smaller miles. They're doing the short haul kinds of things. The railroads, of course, never went to the post offices. I think they said that they were 80 rods. They had to be within 80 rods of a post office, about a quarter of a mile. A rod is not a terminology that I use frequently, but the railroads basically were running intercity, and the star routes were running from post office to post office. So from the 1830s, we've gone from about 34 million miles traveled to about 160, about a five-fold increase over that period of time, and mostly horse-drawn in the 1830s and very heavily steam in the 1870s. So after 1880, just touch on it briefly, the U.S. became total. Alaska that's shown here didn't come into being until the state to the 1850s, about the same time Hawaii did. And what we have then are the railroads with their large locomotives and their steam capability started to drive the whole RPO system, railway post office system, and to dominate the intercity movement of mail. So remember, the post office was servicing this very large population growth that expanded up until the end of the 1800s, and growing shift from rural to urban again in that same time frame. That there was less and less people out on the farm, out in the country, more and more in the cities. So the post office fell off. We've talked about that. Rural Free Delivery did a lot of it because they delivered directly to people and not to a post office. The rail route miles, or the mail miles that were out there, became very substantial for the railroads. You can see here the dominance of the railroads by the end of the 1800s. And what was interesting is that the peak railroad route miles was 1916. And World War I, as some know, the U.S. government took over the railroads for operational purposes. They didn't own it, but they took it over. But the railroad building basically came to a halt. There were some exceptions, but the peak route miles started to decline as we got into World War I and beyond. The miles traveled, became very dominant railroad. You can see the conversion in the middle 1800s of the red horse powered to the star routes, to the fact that the railroads dominated the mail service as we got past the Civil War and into the end of the 1800s. So what we've seen is the route miles have been substantial with star routes, but the miles traveled have shifted. So you've got 350,000 or so route miles out there, but you're running 170 million miles traveled. And of course, my perspective is that it's the miles traveled that are in fact where all of the postal history, all of the envelopes and all of the cancels and all of that was done against the miles traveled, and that makes it significant. So we've seen this thing grow to some steam in the 1840s, to a more significant part of it in the 1850s, just before the Civil War. And by the time we got through the Civil War, steam became the dominant mode, and clearly that in the 1870s. It was, in fact, as Jim Milgram and John Bush had pointed out, one of the significant innovations of the 1800s was the move to steam. And this is just for mail carriage. This doesn't get into the Industrial Revolution and what it did for that. So this whole period from 1839 to 1879 was a major evolution for the post office from horse-drawn to steam managed, and you can see that in these categories. Need to touch briefly on World War I. There were wagons out there that had engines put on them. They're called trucks. Eventually, the post office, but primarily the military, said we need to have standardization of this. So you ended up with internal combustion engines, and that, of course, went over into aircraft that we saw after the World War I, or used in World War I, and afterwards. The internal combustion engine became the dominant capability for the post office department. The railroads continued into the early 1900s, but then have basically disappeared. As a transportation guy for the railroad, I did not have any postal service transportation given to us, either in trailers or containers. They may have been in less than truckload or other kinds of agents, but the post office did not use any kind of direct transportation in the later years. I mentioned the supplement. I just wanted to show it to you briefly. These are two different pages from it, but this is a PDF that Scott has and will be available, and it is the narrative material from the Postmaster Generals that I had captured between 1840 and 1880, and determined that it was way too much for a presentation like this. So what we've done is we have looked at the shift from horsepower to the age of steam, and that carried the United States basically from the 1820s into the 1840s, into the World War I timeframe, and until we transitioned to the internal combustion engine for the 20th century. So that's my material. I hope that you found it of interest, and I'm available to answer questions if you have any.
Okay, thank you, Bill, for a very thorough and detailed presentation. A lot of great information there about the miles traveled for various modes of transportation. One question that I have, Bill, is I'm really curious about this modes not specified. What was the reporting process that something could be sort of classified as not a specified mode?
Well, I was startled by that, uh, Scott. Uh, as I was creating my database, I have this in a large spreadsheet. That the categories started to change, and I was like, "What happened to the categories I was using?" And the modes not specified, of course, were the 1840s. The inferior grade startled me. I just can't understand why someone would use that kind of the word inferior in there. But obviously, when you got into a little bit later, the post office said that the steamboats were inferior to railroads. Um, these are the labels that were on the reporting categories within the Postmaster General reports. And I don't have much further explanation at this point in time because I was pretty consumed in getting the database built. But the categories did change, and that's why I wanted to put them out here so you could see them.
Sure. We have a question from one of our attendees. I'll just read it. What do you think accounts for the virtuous deployment of the U.S. mail service? Was it profit, leadership at a national level, demands of the citizens and consumers?
What I'm hearing is the question was what took place for revenues and expenses and profitability, if you will.
Right.
That as I went through the Postmaster General reports, that fluctuated all over the map, depended on which president was in place. There were years when the Postmaster General said, we're not going to do any postal delivery unless we can make money at it. There are others that said we need to build the capability and we'll just have to trust that the revenues will come along with it. I did not find a consistent postal service policy, if you will. It seemed to vary depending upon the Postmaster General and what was going on in the world. We did have a huge depression in the 1870s, and that influenced things. Post office was always on the edge about whether it was breaking even. I can't use the word profitability, but breaking even. And it was, I think it's a current discussion that goes on.
Did the Postmaster General reports of 1861 to 1865 mention any innovative needs being demanded by Congress or executive departments due to the war?
I didn't see that in there. I wondered. Civil War is of interest to me. What seemed to be there was a consistent um, um let's keep the status quo up, trying to figure out. They were mostly consumed by what they could do to try to deal with the Southern system being taken out, and how do they respond to that? And there was we'd seen a little bit of it in an earlier report. A lot of discussion about the military needs. To me, it was a time of years of pragmatism. How do we keep the system going? The military was demanding tremendous amounts of capacity from the railroad system, and so I didn't see anything particularly new in that time frame that dealt with the new post office. There was a discussion early on, of course, about making a transcontinental railroad, but that got put on hold. The Butterfield stage routes, once the Confederacy happened, they got moved from the southern routes to the northern routes. There were things like that that happened, but I didn't see much new ideas or much commitment. And I attributed it to the fact that they were scrambling just to keep the mail moving and the military moving.
Sure. Someone had a question very similar to something I was thinking about during your talk. I know your talk focused on miles traveled and things like that, but this person asked, what percentage by pieces of mail carried did the rail, steam carry versus the star routes?
That is
Just if you
data
know.
that's there, but I didn't capture it. What you see are the amount of uh, traveled miles paid And there is data within the Postmaster General reports that show from time to time, not consistently, how much weight was moved in these. So most of what is reported is how many miles were paid for by the various contracts, railroads, steamboats, or star routes. I did not capture the amount of weight or the number of pieces of mail, but that is there, and my recollection is it's periodic that someone says we want a census. We want to take a 5-year period and take a look at it to see how many pieces of mail were moved. It was millions and billions of pieces, but it was not something that I captured. It is there, but not something I captured.
We have a number of people very impressed by the amount of data that you had today. Have you ever thought of, I know we will have your presentation up on our Postal History Symposium page after the symposium at some point, or your presentation. Do you ever plan to publish this material into a book or an article? And there's someone I will put you in contact with. He sent in his email that he would be interested in sort of seeing some of your data. So do you ever think about publishing any of this material?
Absolutely. This all started in the late 2019 into early 2020, pre-COVID. Quite honestly, I've been consumed in getting the data captured, and I do have the data in spreadsheet format. The narrative side I've got from basically 1840 to 1880. Those components of narrative within the Postmaster General that refer to modal decisions. There were some interesting ones in there about having too many coins in the post office system that they didn't know how to get rid of them. Some little anecdotes like that. Getting this out and published is something that is of interest to me. I also have an interest in sharing it, that people can utilize the data, and that's why I put the supplement out on the narrative, so there'll be both data and narrative available. I haven't gotten that anchored at this point in time, but it's certainly something that I'm hoping it's beneficial to people. I'm hoping it triggers some thought process. I'm hoping it puts some of their covers in context as to what was going on. And the Postmaster, because the Postmaster General reports are available in Hathy, it's really spectacular. So I was not aware of this when I started this Hathy Trust digital library. That is the verbatim or PDF scans of the Postmaster General reports are there basically from 1850 on. It's sort of erratic on the early ones from Hathy, but those are in the National Postal Museum Library and the Postal Service Library when they open back up.
We also have someone who's like you has been looking at, you mentioned in your talk, the Postmaster General letter books. What are you hoping to find when you continue your research looking at those?
Well, that's a good question. What I ran into with the data collection here is that there, as I showed you, there isn't much before 1840, very little modal stuff before 1840. And so the whole early part of the postal delivery system is not in Postmaster General reports, the printed versions. The handwritten letter books from 1889 to 836, I'm be looking for additional comments on modes and what was done on modes as far as the shifts that happened during that period of time. It hasn't been top of my mind or top of my efforts because it is handwritten. I also am part of the New Netherland Institute that for the last 20 years has been translating the handwritten old Dutch manuscripts in Albany about the early Dutch settlements, and the handwritten documents they're working against have made me be careful in my thought about going after those letter books.
Sure. I know this wasn't the focus of your talk, but somebody asked, what is the proportion of mail carried for citizen use, such as letters and packages, versus business or industrial uses? Don't know if that's something you have researched or not.
I haven't researched it, Scott, and I was in the Postmaster General reports. I don't recall any split between what I would call civilian mail, personal mail, and industry mail. Quite a number of discussions about free mail or free franks and how the post office is going to respond to them. And in some years, I believe there's some separation or accountability of how much free frank mail moved. Generally, I didn't find it in there, and I don't recall anything that split between industrial and civilian. There may be. There's a tremendous amount of data, particularly you get into the 1860s and after. And I have to tell you, I didn't get to all the tables. In the 1890s Postmaster Generals, I've actually got most of those, are in the 400 or 500 page, and they have a excruciating, it's the only word I can use, amount of data in them that I haven't yet looked at. So some of it may be there, but I didn't see it in my work.
Okay. We have a twofold question. Were there many trains from the north to the south before the Civil War? And also, did they operate shorter routes on the two sides without crossing from one to the other, or were the tracks taken out of service?
In the Civil War time frame, there's two answers to the question. One is that the South, from data I've seen, had not developed their rail system to the extent the North had. Part of it is the South was agricultural, and there wasn't all the demand that you sometimes got in the industrial North, where they were looking for components or parts or assemblies to go into manufacturing. So there was less rail in the South. The other issue at the time of the Civil War is that there was no consistency in the gauge of rail. Some were 6 feet, some were 5 feet, some were 4 foot 8.5 inches, which is standard today. And it was one of the things that, as I understand it, the the Union side did was to start standardizing the gauge north of the Confederacy so that they could move trains anywhere. The southern part has still had a fragmentation or a variance in the size of the gauge or the width of the gauge, and therefore wasn't as able to move trains around as completely as they did on the northern side. When the South came in, I mean, that's where I showed you the post office kind of wiped their hands and said, "Hey, we're not going to do anything with those disloyal states. That is just something that we're not going to deal with." And you saw big drop-offs in route miles and miles traveled during that period of time.
I know this question sort of falls outside the bounds of the era you covered here, but if you know, when did airmail become a significant mode of carrying the mail? Like when did it sort of did it ever overtake railroad and some of the other?
Well, two answers to the question. I don't know that the data from airmail overtaking the railroads, or as you transition into the 20th century, I'd have to say air versus surface. That I don't know whether that data exists, and on a historical perspective, from my understanding in the business, I don't think that air would ever take the place or overtake the surface side, because air tended to be doing the first class mail and the expedited mail, and the heavy mail, the parcel post, the newspapers went by surface. The interesting question that someone may want to take a look at: the railroad's growth in the 1860s to the end of the century was haphazard. They were building their own lines. Sometimes there was competition, sometimes there wasn't competition. The post office was terribly frustrated with the railroads charging too much as they saw it. They got some authority from Congress to charge more than they had been charging, but it was a haphazard growth that the post office, I think, just kind of tried to hang on as that expanded. what have seen, and others probably know more than I'm sure they know more than that after World War I, the post office took a very proactive, managed approach to airmail, and in fact, as I understand it, tied into passenger service. So people that were doing airmail, that contract became a source of fairly guaranteed funds, and they also wanted to make sure, post office wanted to make sure that there was passenger service being established at the same time. So my image, and there are others that probably think know better than I, but that the airmail after World War I was much more carefully managed and developed, whereas the railroad in the mid to late 1800s was kind of catch as catch can.
Yeah. You showed a number of slides depicting stamps with modes of transportation. What decade saw the greatest number of transportation stamps, and why do you think that was?
Well, that is a good question. Here is the when I started, this was the summer seminar in 2019. I was looking, I have a database, this is U.S. transportation stamps, and they peaked in the 1990s and early 2000s, late 1980s, 1990s. And that question is one of the questions that I have not answered yet. I have the material, I have the books and the background material, and then like I say, I got sidetracked into the Postmaster General reports. But there's certainly, as we got into the 80s and 90s, it became a huge amount of transportation stamps. Some of it was based around states and celebration of events. Some of it was the stagecoach and, the John Wayne stagecoach movie with John Ford. And there was a real effort on the post office in the late 20th century to have people buy more stamps. And transportation was one of those things that happened. They had the transportation issue, the coil stamps that came out. I was always kind of like, here we are over 100 years after the evolution of transportation for mail, really focusing on it. And I don't as yet have a good handle on that, but it is next on my agenda.
Okay, I think with that answer, we will conclude this session of the 2020 Postal History Symposium. For all of those joining us for this session, we want to thank you for your attendance and ask that you join us on behalf of the 2020 Postal History Symposium, the American Philatelic Society, the American Philatelic Research Library, the National Postal Museum, and the United States Classic Society in thanking Bill for this presentation this morning.